We think that the oil sands have been expanded too rapidly without a serious plan for environmental remediation in the first place. So that's why we don't think it's up to us to decide whether there should be another route for a pipeline, because the real alternative is not an alternative route, it's an alternative economy.
Just an incredible statement there. He's not interested in route number 1, route number 5, route number 10. He doesn't want a pipeline on any route. He doesn't want a pipeline. He doesn't want the oil sands. You've seen me play that clip a dozen times before. That's Gerald Butts, best friend, senior advisor, former principal secretary, and campaign Rasputin to Justin Trudeau. Gerald Butts, an extremist. There he was in his capacity as president of the World Wildlife Fund, campaigning against pipelines and oil sands. Are you surprised at all that he has continued that campaign? Obviously the work of a true believer in Justin Trudeau's PMO. And so comes news that the Federal Court of Appeal has approved a variety of lawsuits against the Trans Mountain Pipeline, a pipeline that Trudeau bought with your taxpayers' dollars off of the Kinder Morgan company that was running it. He bought the existing Trans Mountain Pipeline upon which the expansion might one day be built. But my theory was also paying $4.5 billion for the existing pipeline, and everyone says that was an overpayment of about $1 billion, was not because Trudeau wanted to own it. He was paying $4.5 billion to shut up the owner because he knew that if he ran the pipeline, owned the pipeline, well, no one would complain to him because he would be the one. And explaining the reasons, putting this together, helping figure this out, is our friend Manny Montenegrino, a lawyer and political advisor who now runs Think Sharp Strategy out of Ottawa. Our friend Manny Montenegrino. Manny, great to see you again.
Great to be with you as always, Ezra.
Manny, I don't think I connected the dots there. There was a Federal Court of Appeal ruling that allowed a bunch of challenges to go through. But the shocking news, why don't you tell our viewers, what was it that Trudeau and Butts did that is so unusual, so shocking, so radical for a government and owner of a pipeline when facing lawsuits?
Ezra, I will. I'll get to that right at the end. What I'd like to do is give a history of what has happened with this Trans Mountain Pipeline.
Okay.
And I think it's important because we know now with absolute certainty that we cannot trust what the Prime Minister says. The Prime Minister will say absolutely anything to please a certain segment of Canadians, and we know that he has been found not to be credible by the Ethics Commissioner. So what I will do is look at the facts and then come to a conclusion, because you can't listen to the rhetoric. And let's start. In May of 2017, there was a BC election.
Right.
And if everyone, of course, was paying attention. And in that election, two parties, the Greens and the NDP, were strongly opposed, and they said they were running on the premise that they will block Trans Mountain Pipeline. Well, if we were paying attention, we'd know, okay, that's their position. Well, they won. The Liberals lost, and the Greens and NDP formed a coalition. So as early as 2017 in May, we knew Trans Mountain Pipeline was going to see some trouble. Now, the Prime Minister at that time could have said, if he was seriously concerned about Trans Mountain Pipeline, he could have acted, he could have met, he could have done something. Nothing happened for a year, to the point that a year later, Kinder Morgan, around May, trying to deal with the issue a whole full year without the support of the federal government, found itself frustrated and gave ultimatums. Now, a prime minister with all the powers it has under its constitution could have helped, did nothing. Kinder Morgan was at a peril and said, we are going to leave. What does then Justin Trudeau do? He buys it. He takes $4.5 billion and buys a pipeline under the pretense he's going to build. And you heard the finance minister say, we will have shovels in the ground in August of 2018. Well, that $4.5 billion purchase didn't have a standard condition, and any first-year lawyer would put in a condition that it gets the approval to build the pipeline from federal court. That only happened 3 weeks later, Ezra. 3 weeks later, the Federal Court of Appeal strikes down the permit after spending $4.5 billion. So that tells me, well, wait a minute. They can't be that inept, their lawyers, that didn't understand that this hearing, this decision was going to happen 3 weeks after doling out $4.5 billion. Well, let's assume they made that mistake and they didn't know. What did Justin Trudeau direct at that decision? This is a Federal Court of Appeal making a decision. Did Justin Trudeau appeal to the Supreme Court? And the caliber of lawyers at the caliber of judges at the Supreme Court of Canada that understand the nation and understand would have been a greater review. They did not appeal. Justin Trudeau spends $4.5 billion to buy a pipeline and doesn't appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada when they have thousands of lawyers sitting at justice that would have been very happy to argue the case. Yeah. That should tell you something.
Well, and here's the thing. When you're the government, you have a duty to defend your interests, your projects, your laws. If you lose, you have a duty to appeal unless there's a very sharp policy reason why you choose not to. But when you are now the owner of a pipeline, surely you have another duty, a fiduciary duty, some sort. I mean, it's the government in general should appeal when it loses a case, unless it is just utterly wrong on something and has an about face, which they don't say here. And then when you buy something and you let it wither, you let it waste, and you don't lift a finger, that's my point about it. The only reason they bought it, Manny, my theory is because if it was owned by the private company called Kinder Morgan, and if this had been left to die this way, Kinder Morgan would be screaming bloody murder. They're owned by an American company. They would probably be filing a NAFTA complaint of some sort. So if this were a private pipeline that was so obviously mistreated, that private owners would go nuts. But Trudeau basically said, here's $4.5 billion, just shut up, take the money, and do not comment on anything we're about to do because it's going to get ugly.
So Ezra, you're absolutely right. In August of 2018, after the federal court struck down the permit, the Prime Minister had three fundamental duties. Number one, he had a legal obligation to appeal to the Supreme Court. He had a constitutional obligation because we are asking, Canadians are asking, what is the rules with respect to trans-provincial pipelines and jurisdiction? Only the Supreme Court of Canada can lay out the rules and say who champions the cause. Is it the feds? Is it the province? It's a tricky area of law. So he had a constitutional responsibility to bring to the Supreme Court, and then he had a fiduciary responsibility to taxpayers because we spent $4.5 billion. So there are three duties. But Ezra, it goes on. He chooses not to, and he tells the Canadian people, although he says he's in favor of the pipeline, we will go back and do consultations, we'll discuss, we'll go back and listen to what the federal court gave in its decision, and we will cure the problem. Now, that will take another year. Now, a year, as you know, Ezra, on $4.5 billion is about $225 million worth of buried, sunken, lost interest costs. Yeah. Now, you can say, well, all right. Well, the Prime Minister wants to listen to the federal court without appealing to the Supreme Court. So we spent a year, and my humble estimation, nothing was done. Well, we don't know what has happened, but let's assume that the government acted in good faith. Well, 1 year later, after we have consulted and tried, the government of Canada tried to meet the conditions that were put on by the Federal Court of Appeal a year ago, we now go before the court to say, well, what happened? We go before the Federal Court of Appeal, as you said at the opening, the decision of the court was, well, we're going to let these interveners give them status, and yes, they have a legitimate complaint. even though the government of Canada spent a year consulting and meeting their obligations. You know what happened, Ezra? The government didn't even send its lawyers and produce a case in rebuttal. I mean, can you imagine the madness that we have a court case, federal court, dealing with trans-provincial pipelines where the government spent $225 million in lost interest costs, spent thousands and millions of dollars consulting, and doesn't go to the court and say, here's what we did?
Yeah. You know,
I mean, it's just amazing.
It's almost $1 million a day. It's about $600,000-700,000 a day, and not even showing up. And what could the judges but think if the government wasn't even there to defend? Then a judge, any normal, commonsensical person would say, "Oh, well, the government's fine. They want to be tipped over here. They're not even here to make the case." You know, I want to show you, I think you alluded to it, or maybe I was remembering from your Twitter feed, how this has been excused by the mainstream media, including the CBC. Look at this incredible headline in the CBC. Why did Ottawa fail to defend its Trans Mountain process in court? And then the CBC has the answer. Oh, blame politics. Oh, gee, you know, it's just that there's no person to blame. There's no decider. It's not the Prime Minister. It's just politics, guys. I mean, I've never seen such a pitiful explanation or excuseology, but even they know it was a shock. Even the fact that they felt they had to have that excuseology published shows they know it was a shocking dereliction of duty by Harper. Excuse me, Harper, by Trudeau. Sorry. I'm thinking if only Harper, although this has been going on since the Harper years. Manny, this pipeline was proposed in 2012. It filed with the NEB in 2013. We're coming up on 7 years for this pipeline, and there's no shovel in the ground. Exactly.
So that's what infuriated me the most, is when I read the CBC saying, well, you know, just blame politics. The government spent $4.5 billion to bury a pipeline, not to do anything, spent $225 million, spent a year consulting, and doesn't send lawyers in. Well, that's just politics. I mean, we Canadians were put through hell when a senator spent $90,000, now proven legally, of his own expenses, and Canadians were put through hell over a year because there was no excuse at that time. But here we're talking in the billions, in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and they just slough it off as, well, it's just politics. Well, of course the Prime Minister can't defend the pipeline because he might look bad with some environmentalists. Well, the law is a law in this country. And you know what's offensive, Ezra, and we have seen it, is the diminution of the rule of law under this Prime Minister. Yeah, we know what happened with the obstruction of justice and the report of the ethics commissioner. We know what's happening with China looking at us and saying, you have no rule of law, because the Prime Minister was found to direct, by a judge, ethics judge, was found to direct a obstruction of justice and fire the Attorney General. We see the Prime Minister. And so the rule of law, I mean, I cannot, Ezra, I'm lost for words to sit there and see one of the biggest projects Canadians ever brought, and we don't send in lawyers after a year of negotiations and to say to the court, here's what we did, here's how we met your conditions a year ago. We feel we met that burden, and please give us a pipeline, and not even make those representations. It is more than the $4.5 billion. It is a destruction of the rule of law, because we expect our government to be protecting us in the courts. And you know, Ezra, so when I look at the totality of it, I can only come to one conclusion. And the conclusion is there's absolutely no intent of this government to have the Trans Mountain pipeline going. And I am absolutely certain, given the facts I gave you over 2 years, that if the Liberal government gets reelected, this pipeline will not even see a shovel for 4 years, and it will be just, you know, as everything else, just hidden away. So, so we now have a Prime Minister that fails his ethical duty to appeal, fails his constitutional duty to appeal, fails his financial fiscal duty to appeal, and now fails the whole rudimentary. I mean, I've never been to a court where the other side doesn't appear and let counsel just have the day. It is an affront to the rule of law.
Well, and the thing is, and maybe I've overemphasized this already, if this pipeline were still a privately funded project of Kinder Morgan, they would have raised bloody hell. They would have had their own lawyers there. They would have said to the federal government, you've got to, there would have been someone watching the interests of the pipeline, but they were bought out. They were bought off.
Right.
And by the way, I don't blame, if someone offered me $1 billion more than anything I had was worth, I'd take the money and shut up too. You can't blame Kinder Morgan. But the thing is, without Kinder Morgan, with them paid off, there was no one looking out for it. I'm sort of surprised and disappointed that there wasn't another watchdog that caught this. But let me ask you a question, because I remember when Omar Khadr was captured by the U.S., and that happened under the Liberal watch. That was in the last years of Chrétien and Martin. And then Harper took over sort of halfway through Omar Khadr's tenure in Guantanamo Bay. And I checked, Manny, because I wrote a book about this. I checked, and the Canadian Bar Association did not complain about Omar Khadr's detention in Guantanamo Bay until a particular date, and that is when Stephen Harper became Prime Minister. So when Chrétien and Martin were in office, they didn't care about Omar Khadr. When Harper was in office, they suddenly cared. And let me bring it to my point. I have not heard from the Canadian Bar Association on the ethics of this government, how they sacked Jody Wilson-Raybould, how they tried to undermine the Department of Public Prosecutions, how they have neglected this. Now, maybe I haven't seen it. I did look for the Wilson-Raybould stuff. I think the Canadian Bar Association, which is supposed to be a lawyer's watchdog of sorts, and I certainly haven't seen anything at any law society, I think that the legal profession itself is giving Justin Trudeau a pass on his legal ethical breaches.
Well, you wouldn't be wrong to think that. Ezra, you raised Omar Khadr, and I'm going to try in a few minutes to explain how that is consistent to what the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did with Trans Mountain. Omar Khadr, very simply, was abused, not have his rights read to him, his charter rights under the Liberal government 2002-2003. But at that time, the Liberal government was acting properly because there was no law saying that a Canadian on foreign soil is entitled to charter protection. That decision was made in 2010 by the Supreme Court, and retroactively to 2003 when Omar Khadr was detained. The great legal issue there, in my opinion, is, are there damages arising from a decision made from the Supreme Court 2010 to retroactively apply to conduct done by a government, then the Liberal government in 2003, when they were at that time acting within the law? And the second question is, would those damages be anywhere significant because Canada or any Canadian, not one Canadian, laid his hands on Omar Khadr, and it was all done by the Americans. And you know, and I know, the but-for test, and that is the test that the courts apply, and that says if Canada understood and had that decision of 2010 by the Supreme Court, let's say 1988, that says Canadians abroad are entitled to charter protection, and the Canadian government, the Liberal government in 2003, provided the charter rights, would the American government have acted any differently? And the answer is absolutely not. He was in Gitmo. The Americans dealt with him, and so the damages would have been zero. And here's why I bring that to you, is because, again, the Prime Minister did not allow that case to go to court and didn't allow the rule of law to determine what happens in these rare rare factual circumstances when a Supreme Court decision was made in 2010, retroactively to 2003, over a Canadian that Canada had no control over in Gitmo by the American government. That would have been a triable issue. And in my opinion, the damages would have been zero. And that's why it did not go to court. And there's that situation again, and I bring it back to Trans Mountain. Why didn't the Prime Minister he says to Canadians that he was offended and hurt by this decision and upset like every other Canadian? Well, if you were, let's go to court, let the judge decide, let there be a full hearing. The decision was made in secret, and rule of law didn't apply. So this government under Justin Trudeau has a history of abuse of rule of law with SNC Lavalin, with the firing of the Attorney General, with the Omar Khadr secret deal, with Trans Mountain not appealing and not sending lawyers in. It is, as much as I care about the $4.5 billion and the $225 million, Ezra, I see that this government uses the courts and the rule of law as, we'll say what CBC says, blame politics.
Yeah,
it's just politics.
It's just it's in the air. It's like who can blame? Who knows why the wind blows? Manny, you and I have talked about ethics and law and fiduciary duties and what a lawyer's duties are. But if you pull the camera back, if you were some global oil and gas or pipeline company, and it's one of the biggest industries in the world, and by the way, there's not a single authoritative forecaster who doesn't see the demand for fossil fuels continuing to grow for the foreseeable future, especially as people in the third world get lifted up by oil and gas in the modern economy. Oil and gas will remain king along with coal. It's a huge industry, Manny, and it's dominated by international players. If you were a big oil, gas, pipeline company based in Texas, based in London, based in Germany, you wouldn't dive into the minutia as you and I have just been doing for 15 minutes. You would just say, oh, Canada, risky. You can't trust anything. Nothing happens. They always find an excuse for not doing something. Let's not put a new mega project in Canada. Let's put it in the States under Trump. Let's put it in Australia. Let's put it in Poland. But let's not put it in Canada. Whatever the details are, the headline is, you should not invest in Canada. That's what I think, if I was a foreign investor. Well,
Ezra, you got it wrong. It's not risky. It's known. I mean, you're saying risky. Risk means that there's an element of hope and chance that a project goes through. Ezra, the facts are clear. We have Gerald Butts, who is the director of ideology of this government, who resigned in disgrace and is back at it, and the media don't care, whose primary purpose in government, we saw it in Ontario and in Canada, is to keep oil in the ground. You saw that clip. So they have maneuvered successfully to kill all pipelines and pretend to keep a pipeline by killing it with buying it and doing nothing. There is no risk. If I were advising, and listen, it's not a surprise. They've already left. They've already left Canada. There is no risk in Canada. It is a completely verboten that oil and gas under this government, this federal liberal government, will not see the light of day. And that is just a fact. And people are going to move their dollars, and they are moving their dollars, and they're moving out of Canada.
Manny, I want to leave you with one image, and I'll email you this whole document because I know you'll find the whole thing interesting. Here is something dated 2008. It's called the Tar Sands Campaign. This is an official document by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund in New York. And you can see on the participants page, the logo page, there's the cover of it. But on the logos page, you can see the World Wildlife Fund. And that is, of course, Gerald Butts' group. So Gerald Butts' group was taking money from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. You can see Greenpeace is on there too. You can see Sephora Berman's Forest Ethics. But look at the map The map, and this is 11 years ago, shows all the proposed pipelines. Northern Gateway was one of them. They had the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline. They had a kill map. They had a map of targets. And here we are 11 years later, and Gerald Butts is no longer an outsider. Look at that, Mackenzie Valley, Gateway Pipeline, tanker train. You can see the map there. Mission accomplished. 11 years later, Manny, they're no longer on the outside protesting, they're on the inside. And in fact, it wasn't just Gerald Butts. 2 other organizations there. Marlo Reynolds, who headed up Pembina, is now Catherine McKenna's chief of staff. And there are other organizations, the Sierra Club, their president works for the Liberal government. The people who wrote that attack plan carried out the plan under Gerald Butts and Justin Trudeau. That's why there hasn't been a pipeline built, and that's why there never will be as long as Trudeau's in office. Last word to you, Manny.
Yeah, absolutely right. And you know, it's not a shock to the outside investment community outside of Canada. They know it clearly as I know it clearly. The problem with Canadians, many of us are good and we want to believe the word of our leader. And so we believe, Ezra, recall that motion that was done a few months ago where the government of Canada, it was big news, the government of Canada, the cabinet voted in favor of the Trans Mountain pipeline. I mean, that was just to get votes. I mean, can you imagine? They bought the pipeline for $4.5 billion. 7 months later, they have a cabinet discussion on whether they should approve the pipeline. You approved it with our dollars. So it is just amazing. It is very clear to the world. It's not clear to Canadians. You are not understanding. We'll go through the facts. Go through what happened in 2 years. It will not be a pipeline in Canada, period.
I hate to say it, you're right. And we have to hear it because we have to know that's the situation we're in. Manny, as always, it's great to have your legal, political analysis. Thank you for being so generous with your time. You're a fan favorite with viewers because you really help us think things through. I appreciate that. Thank you, Ezra. Thank you for having me on, on your show. You're always welcome, my friend. Have a great weekend. Take care. All right, there's Manny Montenegrino. He's the CEO of Think Sharp, and he joined us today via Skype from Ottawa. That's an excerpt from the Ezra Levant show. Every day, I do a video monologue, and then I interview an interesting guest, and then I end by reading my hate mail. But you've got to subscribe to it, which you can do at therebel.media/shows.